John F. Kennedy. You know, even all these decades later, his name it brings up these powerful images, right? Youth, charisma, a presidency that was packed with soaring ambition and, honestly, world-altering peril. He is, without a doubt, one of America's most iconic and most mythologized leaders.
You've all heard it, right? His inaugural address gave us one of the most famous lines in political history, a call to service that really defined a whole generation. But the man behind those famous words? Well, that's where the story gets way more complex and a whole lot more fascinating.
So that's the real question, isn't it? To really get the legend, you have to peel back the layers. We've got to go way back to the beginning to see what challenges actually forged the man he became.
All right, so let's start here. Long before he was commander-in-chief in the White House, he was commanding a tiny patrol boat in the middle of the Pacific. And believe me, his journey to get there was anything but a sure thing.
Okay, this is what's so wild. The image the public saw was this picture of perfect health and energy. But behind the scenes, Kennedy was in almost constant pain. He was even told no by the Army, medically disqualified, before his family's connections helped get him into the Naval Reserve. A huge, huge contrast.
And this is where the story becomes the stuff of legend. Picture it. Middle of a moonless night in the Pacific, and his boat is literally cut in half by a Japanese destroyer. He messes up his already terrible back even worse, but he still leads his surviving crew on this grueling swim to a remote island. And the most famous part? He's towing a badly burned crewman for miles with a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth. His leadership over those next 7 days, and yeah, that famous message he carved on a coconut, it saved every single one of them. Just like that, he was a war hero.
And you gotta love this response. That's classic Kennedy right there. That witty, self-deprecating humor was already his trademark. And that kind of charm, well, it was going to serve him really, really well when he decided to swap the battlefield for the political arena.
So let's talk about that path, because that whole war hero narrative, it turned out to be the perfect launchpad for a political career that took off like a rocket.
I mean, look at this climb. He goes from congressman to senator to the Democratic nominee for president in just over a decade. That's fast. But to actually win the whole thing, he had to master a totally new political weapon: television.
And this right here was the game changer. The first ever televised presidential debate. It was a moment where image suddenly became just as important as the words themselves. Kennedy, he just got it. He looked cool, calm, tanned. He spoke right to the camera, like he was talking to you in your living room. Nixon, on the other hand, well, he looked pale, he was sweating, he just seemed uncomfortable. And get this, people listening on the radio actually thought Nixon won. But for the millions watching on TV, Kennedy was the clear winner, no contest.
0.2%. Think about that. In an election this unbelievably close, that TV performance was everything. He beat Nixon by one of the slimmest margins in American history. You can make a really strong case that the entire presidency was won right there, under those hot studio lights.
Okay, so he wins, and as president, Kennedy is thrown immediately into the fire. We're talking about the absolute peak of the Cold War, where the stakes weren't just about winning an election anymore. The stakes were human survival, period.
And his start in foreign policy was rough. It began with a really humbling, very public disaster. But that failure, it turned out, was a critical lesson for the much, much bigger test that was just around the corner.
First up, the Bay of Pigs. A total catastrophe. It was this botched invasion of Cuba that just blew up in their faces. And to his credit, Kennedy stood up and took full responsibility. But then, just a year later, the stakes go from bad to, well, apocalyptic. U.S. spy planes discover Soviet nuclear missiles being set up in Cuba.
So for 13 days, the entire world just held its breath. Imagine being in his shoes. How do you pull the world back from the very edge of nuclear war? One wrong move, one tiny miscalculation, and it is game over for everyone. And this is what's so crucial. A lot of his advisors were screaming for immediate airstrikes. Go in, take them out. But Kennedy pushed back. He chose a naval quarantine instead, basically a blockade, to buy them time for diplomacy. Behind the scenes, there were these incredibly tense, secret negotiations. In the end, a deal was made. The Soviets pull their missiles out of Cuba, and the U.S. secretly agrees to pull its missiles out of Turkey later on. It was an absolute masterclass in high-stakes crisis management.
So after staring straight into the abyss and pulling the world back, Kennedy also turned his eyes to the future. He pushed this really ambitious agenda he called the New Frontier.
And it was a call to action on pretty much every front you could imagine: the economy, social justice, and of course, science.
And honestly, nothing captured the spirit of the new frontier better than this. He didn't just frame the space race as some competition with the Soviets. No, he framed it as a test of America's character, a symbol of the hard stuff, the necessary work that the country needed to tackle, not just in space, but everywhere.
And the new frontier wasn't just about space. It was also about tackling poverty and creating new opportunities, which gave us things like the Peace Corps. But maybe the toughest frontier of all was right here at home. Kennedy was, let's be honest, pretty cautious on civil rights at first. He was worried about losing support from Southern Democrats. But the moral pressure from the movement just kept growing, and eventually it forced his hand.
And you can see his actions getting bolder and bolder over time. He puts Thurgood Marshall on a high federal court, he sends federal troops to make sure the University of Mississippi is integrated, and then, finally, the big one. In June of '63, he goes on national TV and calls civil rights a moral issue, proposing the legislation that would eventually become the Civil Rights Act. You can really see him evolving on what was the defining domestic issue of his time.
So by the fall of 1963, it really feels like Kennedy is hitting his stride, you know? The civil rights bill is moving forward, things of the Soviets have cooled down a bit, and he's already gearing up for re-election. It felt like things were really starting to happen. But it was all about to come to a sudden, shocking end.
And then, Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. On a sunny afternoon, that vibrant young president was gone. Just in an instant, it plunged the entire nation and really the whole world into this deep, profound shock that people still feel today.
And that's the thing about his legacy. It's sort of frozen in time, isn't it? It's this mix of very real accomplishments. I mean, he steered us through the Cuban Missile Crisis, he kicked off the race to the moon, but all of that is tangled up with this overwhelming sense of unfulfilled promise, of everything that was left undone. And so we're left with that huge, unanswerable question that just kind of haunts his memory, right? What might have been? What would have happened if he'd lived? It's that question that makes his story, his presidency, feel forever unfinished, and why we're still so fascinated by him today.